Rockaways Productions presents The Casey Waters Show, Episode 534, The Truth Behind the Truth. Hello, I'm your host, Casey Waters. Today, I will continue with Watching the Authority. Here, I look at the nature of authority and how sometimes it can be used to control your behavior, among other things. Then it's on to the truth behind the truth. Here I look at the complex nature of the truth and how ascertaining what's really going on sometimes could be a little involved. Today's show will feature background footage from Strawberry Gap Trail. Strawberry Gap Trail is located in Girton, North Carolina. To get there from Asheville, take 74A East. After you cross into Henderson County, it's the first road on the right. It goes into a little parking area. The trailhead is at the end of it. I did not hike the entire length of the trail. I only hiked a portion of it. But I did make it up to Ferguson Peak and a little past that. So, now let's continue with Watching the Authority. Well, you have to look at authority and power. The more someone gains authority, the more power they get to control and influence you. Well, you know the rest of the story. You can fill in the next line now, can't you? Absolute power does what? Corrupts absolutely. Yeah, you got it. You remember. Well, that's because it's often true. Most of the time. Almost all the time, perhaps. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. We have to really look at this. Of course, we got it going on with President Trump, but it's going on perhaps in many other areas too. Perhaps with other people in authority. Perhaps they have too much power and they're getting a little too corrupt and their authority needs to be reined in. Someone needs to investigate them. Someone needs to watch and monitor them. Sure, that's what is needed to reduce the corruption. And when corruption is reduced, well, perhaps there'll be more resources available to us all, and especially to the poorest amongst us. Never forget the trickle-up theory. Put the money in the hands of the poorest people. They don't hold on to it. It disappears. It's spent instantly, stimulating the economy. And the money trickles up to those greedy corporations. So sure, you put the money in the hands of poor people and it quickly trickles up and stimulates the economy. You put a bunch of money in the hands of rich people, well, they might not spend much of it, and there might not be much trickle down. Trickle up works far more efficiently, as far as how much of the dollar really stimulates the economy and how fast it happens. A lot of times when you need economic stimulus, you want it done quickly now, don't you? You don't want to wait 5 years. No, how about 5 weeks? Yeah, that's probably about right. Seriously. Put the money in the hands of poor people. Give them a big dividend. Well, then we have to look at authority and racism. Yeah, this could get real ugly and real quick. and it already has. Just look at history. Sure. And a lot of history is whitewashed, of course. You don't always hear about the worst of the worst. You have to really do some digging. Sure. But there's some awful things that have happened where authority was used for racist purposes, and people suffered at the hands of that racism and at the hands of that racist authority. And it was there in the distant past, and it's always been there, the racist authority. And it was there through slavery, through the 1900s with sharecroppers and Jim Crow laws, and now it comes back again with masked ICE agents. So we have to look at all of this. But anyway, there's authority and racism, but it always comes back to who watches the watchers. So it is up to all of us to watch those in authority and to make sure that there's people and networks to watch those in authority, and to perhaps make sure that they don't have too much control over our lives. After all, it is often best for us to decide what is best for us, instead of some arbitrary authority. Sure, we know what is best. We don't need other people to figure it out for us. We need to develop the confidence and skill to navigate our lives well. And we need to develop good judgment, to learn from our mistakes, to not repeat them. Then we won't need someone in authority over us, because we'll have better self-control. We can do it. We could use better judgment, monitor those in authority, and reduce the scope of their power. Sure, at least where appropriate. Sure, as I said, every situation is different. And so we continue to ask, who is watching the authority? Now, it is time for the truth behind the truth. Here, I look at, the complicated nature of, whatever is true, whatever we might call the truth. Often we oversimplify, and typically the truth is kind of complicated. So sometimes through oversimplification, we could lead ourselves astray, perhaps making the wrong decision. So this is a complicated, involved section, and I probably won't cover everything involved. For getting at the real truth, whatever that might be, could be a lot more difficult than we realize. And, sometimes the storyline changes over generations, and the truth in history changes over generations. So you have to think of that too, among many other things. So, let's just jump in and look at things in general. So, when we have a set of facts, we might say, this is the cause of all of this. This explains what happened. This explains this set of facts. But typically, it's a little more complicated than that. And there are often several factors involved in explaining a quote set of facts or in explaining what happened and things like that. Things are often a little more complicated than we realized, and often we get the simplified version of things. Well, it's not always, quote, the news outlet's fault. Sometimes, especially with me, it is my fault because I don't have enough time, or so I claim. So I only have time for the simple version. I don't have time to absorb all the complexity. And even if I did have the time, could I still remember it all? Well, who knows? But the most important thing is I don't have time for it. I need the simplified version anyway, or at least most of the time, and well, perhaps a lot of you all are similar. We don't have time to really analyze and get the complicated version of something. But sometimes we do have time, and sometimes it is our job to make time to really analyze the complicated version of things, to truly figure out the truth behind the truth. So, in addition to the complicated nature of explaining things, well, there's different kinds of thinking. Sure. I guess is what I'm getting at is, there's learning of information, learning of facts, but there's also original thinking and creative thinking. And they operate a little differently. At least I'm assuming that. But let's look at it in a little more detail. So, we have our creative thinking. We create things. We imagine things. We're artists of sorts. But is what we're creating really original? Or are we just borrowing other people's ideas? We have to think about this. Original thinking might be a little harder to come by than we realized. A lot of things that we think are original ideas might in fact be borrowed, or at least partially borrowed. Sure. I guess every once in a while we do have something really original, and we'll be like, well, how come no one else has thought of that? Am I the first one to think this? Is there a really connection here that everyone else missed? Perhaps so. Well, that's what I'm talking about. These kind of eureka moments of discovering the truth behind the truth. So, often it takes time to do all this analysis and figure out what's really going on. So, what else is going on? Well, just because we're dealt a series of, quote, facts, all facts are not facts. a lot of times they're distorted perceptions, perhaps only applying to a limited area or a limited group of people, or perhaps only applying under certain conditions. Sometimes news reporters will say something is a fact and act like it applies to almost all situations, when in fact it might be a little more limited in scope, only applying to a few specific situations. So we have to check our facts. And sometimes what is said is true is not true. Of course, there's all this fake news going on, and that feeds into it. And then there's the false narratives. That is, people just making claims or building a story or scenario based upon incomplete information. Sometimes we could let our prejudice get in the way. And sometimes we don't take time to do the research we really need to do, or we don't have enough help doing it. I guess that is unfortunate, and I'm assuming this is a common problem. We need more researchers. Sure we do. We need people to take time in areas they want to learn about and really figure out how things truly work through research, fact-checking, experimentation, and other things. So, we have to get past false narratives by doing our research more and trying to find good sources of information. The problem is fake news is out there and perhaps becoming more common. Well, there's the phenomenon of clickbait. People wanting to post an interesting video or blog or whatever about some news story, but it's all fake, but it seems really realistic. Through using artificial intelligence and other tools, well, people can be made to say and do things they don't actually say or do. So someone could make me say anything, and I guess they could do it with you too. It gets a little frightening, I guess, now doesn't it? We don't know what's real. We have to use our best judgment to discern. If we are unsure, I guess I'm talking about people old like me, well, perhaps we need the help of our younger friends. Sure, teenagers, perhaps even people younger than that, who could figure out what is artificial intelligence and what is real. Perhaps even better than we can. If not, we could help them. Somebody's got to figure it out. And I guess artificial intelligence is getting more clever and cunning and more realistic all the time. So soon it might be difficult to discern what is made with AI and what is real. What someone really said, or what's just an interesting parody or fake news. So, we also got to think of history. Well, history is typically written by the victors. So, the losers don't have their story told. and the victors might make the losers seem less worthy than they really are, or less qualified, or less entitled, or less sophisticated, or whatever, just to make their victory seem more logical. But often it isn't very logical. And sometimes victories and wars and so on might be a little arbitrary, perhaps just to satisfy someone's greed. Oh well, we often all pay the price for that. We often pay the price for someone's greed. And then, of course, history is rewritten. It is written again, sure, as people's attitudes change over the generations. They might see historical events in a new light and rewrite history, perhaps to a less accurate interpretation, just to satisfy their current worldview, which might involve prejudice. So we have to step back and really look at things. We have to wake up, so to speak. Anyway, so a lot of times, well, it's the explanation. Someone explaining an event or a phenomenon, and how much truth is in that explanation. Often, important factors are deliberately omitted because they don't suit the narrator's, point of view as far as history, religion, politics, or other things. So they might just disregard important contributing factors because they don't line up well with their narrative and they don't promote their worldview. So this is probably often the case. Just like history is often not accurately told because it's too upsetting if it was accurately told. There's always people in power, people who want to influence things, people who want their version of events told, even though it might not be the real version. It gets tricky here finding the truth behind the truth. I told you it was. And it's probably even more difficult than I'm talking about. Why? Because I've probably forgot to explain certain things. And I don't know all the factors involved. All the factors that could make it really difficult to find the truth. So, well, I guess there's the truth, talking about truth and explanation and how to explain things and getting it right. Well, a good example is the ice storm we just had on January 24th and 25th, 2026. So now it's the 26th. And everything's clear and cold and the storm's over. But it was an ice storm. But it was forecast to be a devastating ice storm with ice totals of an inch, perhaps even more, which would have brought down numerous trees and power lines and so on. However, it was more like a half an inch of ice. perhaps about half of what they were expecting. The damage was less. Here, we didn't lose power. We didn't have to rely on our generator, which is nice. Are there any trees across the driveway? Well, I'm not absolutely sure. I haven't checked yet. Hopefully not. Perhaps a lot of icy patches. I'll just have to figure it out tomorrow. It's so cold, I don't want to go out there now. But what made the storm last? Why was it just a half an inch of ice instead of a full inch? Well, I remember it well. It was cold, colder than I expected. By 10 o'clock at night, it was only 16 degrees. Yet it was drizzling, and maybe drizzle and sleet mixed, implying a low, warm cloud layer on top of a very shallow, very cold layer of air. Perhaps not even 1,000 feet thick, or perhaps just a couple of 1,000 feet thick. Something very narrow, something very cold, and perhaps a little dry. Just dry enough to reduce that rain. I could see it on radar. The storm kept advancing towards us, but the areas of precipitation would fall apart and become reduced as they approached us, as if something was keeping it from raining, something was reducing the rain. Well, I guess dry air. So this dry tongue, I guess, coming in with the cold air at a low altitude, right? Well, it came in from the east and it went across us in Henderson County, North Carolina, and kept going towards the southwest on into Georgia, and even going to Casey Waters Show. Producer Casey Waters. Graphic editing Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, CaseyWaters2 at CaseyWaters.com.